So this is the second in a four-part series where we are examining the evidence surrounding the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. In the first lesson, we looked at um, the uh, the execution, the crucifixion, some of the facts surrounding it, the historical data, and so forth. And today we're going to look a little further into it as well, and some of the earliest accounts that we can rely upon from eyewitnesses to the events that we're looking at. So let me just share my screen, and we're going to take a look at the evidence, Easter, the evidence. Looking at the evidence for the crucifixion and the resurrection. Here's a quote from William Edwards. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, the spear to his side. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. And we did look at that a bit last week, talking about the flogging and what appear to be multiple floggings that took place, and the devastation to the body that they themselves would have imposed before he was even put on the cross. But we're going to look further into some additional evidence. And so sit back, and here is Lee Strobel. This is taken from his book, The Case for Easter, which I highly recommend. And
There was one face I would commonly see when I was a legal journalist covering major trials for the Chicago Tribune. His name was Dr. Robert J. Stein, the medical examiner of Cook County, Illinois, who would testify about the autopsies he would perform in homicide cases. In all, he conducted 20,000 autopsies, in each case determining the manner of death and the cause of death for the victim. Now, for Jesus of Nazareth, the manner of death is indisputable. He died from the effects of crucifixion, a humiliating, painful method of execution, so brutal that they had to invent a new word to describe it: excruciating, which literally means out of the cross. Cicero called it a cruel and disgusting punishment, adding that the very mention of the cross should be far removed, not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, his ears. Crucifixion was brutally efficient. There is no record of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Now, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, did write about one incident where someone survived a partial crucifixion. He said, "I saw many captives crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind and went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered." But what actually killed the unfortunate victims of crucifixion? In other words, what would Dr. Stein list as the cause of death on their death certificates? Well, we'll examine that in this session as we continue to look at the first of 4 E words that summarize the evidence for the resurrection. As you might recall, this E stands for execution. That Jesus was a victim of crucifixion is such a well-established historical fact that you would get laughed out of a major academic institution if you claimed, well, no, Jesus really wasn't crucified. Why? Because much of what we know about the ancient world comes to us from one or maybe two sources. But for Jesus' crucifixion, we not only have multiple early first century accounts in the New Testament, but we've also got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible. We have Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Tacitus, another early historian, Lucian, Mirabar Serapion, and even the Jewish Talmud agrees that he was crucified. Jesus would have been nailed to the cross with spikes like this one. This is a reproduction of the size and weight and sharpness of the kind of spikes that Romans commonly used in crucifixion. They would have been driven through his ankle bones and also through his wrists. Now, I know most paintings show that the spikes go through his palms, but his weight would have caused the skin to tear and he would have fallen off the cross. And in the language of the day, the wrist was considered part of the hand. Now, the nail would have crushed the median nerve, which runs out to the hand. The pain would have been like taking a pair of pliers and squeezing your funny bone. The spikes fulfill the prophecy in Psalm 22, verse 16, which says, "They pierced my hands and feet," which incidentally was written some 1,000 years before the time of Christ and centuries before Rome even began to use crucifixion as a method of execution. Well, once hoisted on the cross, Jesus' shoulders would have been dislocated. This fulfills Psalm 22, verse 14, which says, "All my bones were out of joint." By the way, Jesus specifically applied Psalm 22 to himself when he cried out its opening words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So what's the cause of death in crucifixion? Well, several things can contribute to death, including the great loss of blood, but the primary cause of death is asphyxiation. As the crucifixion expert, Dr. Alexander Metherell, described to me, hanging in that vertical position puts stress on the chest muscles and diaphragm and locks the lungs into the inhale position. In order to exhale, the victim must push up with his feet so the tension on the muscles would be eased for the moment. This meant scraping his bloodied back against the coarse wood of the cross. After then managing to exhale, he would then be able to relax down and take in another breath. And he'd repeat this process up and down until exhaustion took over and he wouldn't be able to breathe anymore. He would go into respiratory acidosis, where the carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to rise. This would lead to an irregular heartbeat, and with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death, which is when he would have been able to say, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he died of cardiac arrest. Metherell added one other important detail. The torture of the cross would have resulted in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called a pericardial effusion, as well as around the lung, which is called a pleural effusion. When the Roman soldier wanted to confirm that Jesus was dead, he thrust a spear that apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. When the spear was yanked out, some fluid, the effusions, came out with the appearance of a clear fluid along with blood. And although John probably didn't understand what he was describing, this is corroborated in John 19, verse 34, which says, "One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water." Friends, there is no question that Jesus was dead when he was taken off the cross. You can't fake the inability to breathe for very long. Besides, the spear in the heart would have settled the matter. Furthermore, the Roman soldiers weren't about to allow someone to survive a crucifixion. If they did, they themselves would have faced execution. And one more point. If Jesus did manage to survive, think of the horrible physical condition he would have been in. He never would have inspired the disciples to go out and risk their own lives by proclaiming that this pathetic figure was the Lord of life who triumphed over the grave. They wouldn't have been motivated to start a worldwide movement on the glorious promise that someday we would survive death as Jesus had. Instead, they would have called an ambulance. No, Jesus was dead. Even the prestigious, peer-reviewed, secular Journal of the American Medical Association published an analysis of Jesus' crucifixion and concluded, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." Now, if you don't believe that, we can go to one of the most liberal New Testament scholars, John Dominic Crossan, who said, Jesus' death by execution under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. And if you don't believe him, we can go to an agnostic New Testament scholar like James Tabor, who said, quote, "I think we need have no doubt that given Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, that he was truly dead." And if you don't believe him, we can go to an atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, who will tell you, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." Now, I don't know how much you studied ancient history, but there are very few facts of ancient history that a critical, skeptical, atheist historian like Gerd Ludemann will say are indisputable. One of them is the death of Jesus by crucifixion. So the first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports or early accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that came virtually immediately after his death. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the idea of the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legends to develop in the ancient world, so I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, legends were spawned, mythologies were spun, stories were invented, including the claim that he rose from the dead. But what I learned decimated the idea that the resurrection is a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church, a statement of conviction that the first Christians rallied around based on facts that they knew to be true. Now, this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. He rose on the third day. And it mentions then specific individuals and groups to whom he appeared. Now, what's important about this creed is how immediately it developed after Jesus' death. Too early to explain it away by saying it's a legend. My friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, a leading resurrection scholar, came up with the timeline of this creed. We start with a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth about 22 to 25 years after Jesus' death. We call it 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting at verse 3, we find this creed. Here's what Paul wrote. "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." So let's pause there. This is technical rabbinic language in which Paul is saying, in essence, I received this sacred material from reliable sources, and I don't want to change anything. I simply want to turn around and pass it on to you because it's so important. Now, notice too that he uses the past tense. He says, I gave the Corinthians this creed on an earlier visit. So what is the creed? Paul goes on, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Now, notice how this mentions that there were at least 500 witnesses, most of whom are still living, though others have died. Now, in a sense, Paul is saying, hey, look, if you don't believe me, go ask these eyewitnesses. They're still around. They'll confirm the story. Now, you don't issue a challenge like that unless you're certain they're going to back you up. Now, here's the thing. If Paul wrote this letter 22 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and he had already given the creed earlier to the church in Corinth, this means we can date it to about 20 years after Jesus' death. Now, let's stop there. Historically speaking, that is very impressive, especially when you consider that the first two biographies of Alexander the Great, written by Arrian and Plutarch, were written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. So within 20 years, that's very quick on the historical scale. But we can go back even earlier than that. How? Because we know that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a hater and persecutor of Christians. About 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, Saul was on the road to Damascus when, bam, he has this encounter with the risen Christ, and he becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Now, many scholars believe that they're the ones who gave him this creed about the resurrection, which he then later writes in the letter to the church in Corinth. But other scholars say, well, maybe he received this creed 3 years later when he went to Jerusalem and he met for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are specifically mentioned in the creed, Peter and James. Paul described that meeting in Galatians, where in Galatians 1, verse 18, he uses the Greek word hysterio, which suggests that this was an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What did you see? What did you experience? Many scholars believe it was during this meeting that Paul was given this creed by 2 people cited in the creed itself. But either way, this means he was given the creed within 1 to 6 years after Jesus' death, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. So there's no big time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. Here we have the equivalent of a news flash from ancient history. In fact, one of the most prominent scholars in this area, Dr. James D.G. Dunn, said this tradition, by which he means this creed, this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. Within months. Now, this is especially important when we consider that one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford, studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. But we don't have any generations passing here. We've got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. Friends, this is historical gold. Historians drool over stuff like this. And that's not the only early report we have about the resurrection. We have others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and Paul's epistles, all of which date back so early that they were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. Friends, we have an execution. Jesus was dead. Then we have early reports that he rose from the dead, accounts so immediate that you can't dismiss them as being legend. But that's not all we have. We have two more words that begin with the letter E and which complete our case for Easter. We'll cover those in our next session, so stay tuned. All through history, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus has convinced skeptics that he is who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God. One example is James, the half-brother of Jesus. Now, we know from the Gospels that Jesus had four half-brothers, James, Judas, Joseph, and Simon, as well as some half-sisters whose names aren't recorded. And we also know that James was not a follower of Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. However, this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that the risen Christ appeared to James. He sees the evidence for the resurrection with his own eyes. And so what happens to James? He doesn't just become a Christian, but he becomes a leader of the church in Jerusalem and is later martyred for his faith in Jesus, the resurrected Son of God. Asked one scholar, what would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord? Really, the only thing that could account for that would be what's reported in the early creed, that the crucified Jesus appeared alive to James. Friends, that's the power of the resurrection to change a life and to change an eternity.
So anyway, a lot of information there. Continuing from the last lesson and discussing the actual effects of the crucifixion. As I said in the last lesson, if you want to refer back, we talked about the effects of the flogging itself, the tremendous loss of blood, in addition to the excruciating pain. The fact that Jesus would have been in basically a medical shock before he was even placed on the cross. And Lee Strobel went through the multiple accounts that we have from non-Christian sources that affirm that indeed Jesus was crucified as Christians believe and affirm, and that certainly he was dead when they took him down from the cross. The Romans certainly were experts at execution and execution by crucifixion. And certainly, as I said, and as Lee Strobel said, this is affirmed by multiple sources that, in fact, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, was nailed to a cross, ultimately died, and a spear lanced into his heart and lung to make sure. And obviously, the outflow of water and blood was explained by Mr. Strobel. In terms of the medical effects of the crucifixion itself. Just to quickly review, he then talked about the importance of having early accounts, early eyewitnesses, and the value of having accounts from such an early point in time, much sooner than many many expect to see in accounts of historical and particularly ancient historical events. As Lee Strobel said, maybe even going right up to within months of the actual events, we have accounts. And of course, the existence of the creed is something that he talked about. Creating a creed, much like having a song, it's easier to remember, it's easier to pass down. We know in the Christian church, having the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, that these are things that are very easily memorized and therefore are very easily taught and passed down. We looked at the creed from 1 Corinthians, the letter of Paul to the Corinthian church, where he's passing along this creed that has been given to him. And of course, not to belabor the point, but Lee Strobel was indicating what the creed said and how early it necessarily was. And of course, talking about Paul himself and his own encounter, his conversion, having encountered the risen Christ himself. And of course, as I said, Lee Strobel kind of relayed to us the leading up to his including the creed in 1 Corinthians. So here is that creed from 1 Corinthians. And again, he read at least parts of it. Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you. Obviously, he had preached to the Corinthians in the Corinthian church, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel, you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. And here's the creed. For what I received, I passed on to you. So again, Paul received this. It's something that was passed down to him, and he's passing it down further, as we do with creeds. As of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. You can see elements of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed here, actually. And you can see, as Lee pointed out, the fact that Paul is saying there was an occasion where the resurrected Christ appeared to 500 of the brothers. Now, in this culture, they would only count the men in the crowd. So in fact, the crowd was more than likely much more than 500 if you counted women and perhaps even children that were in the crowd that he appeared to. And then, of course, he also appears to, or he references the appearance to himself as well there at the end, describing himself as one abnormally born, still exhibiting regret for him having persecuted Christians before his own conversion. So that is the lesson for today. A few discussion questions for consideration that you can think about on your own during the class. We will discuss these, the importance of the early reports, the importance of the creed, what in that creed is most meaningful or speaks most loudly to you. The arguments against the resurrection that skeptics and unbelievers purport to explain the empty tomb. Is there anything you've learned in this lesson that provides you an answer to arguments against the resurrection, things that Lee Strobel has presented so far? And certainly, what difference does the empty tomb make to you? If you accept that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historical event, what difference does it make to you? And therefore, what effect should it have on your life? So that's lesson 2. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully it helps to firm the foundation of your faith. As we said in the first lesson, the crucifixion and the resurrection are the foundation of the Christian faith, and everything else is built upon that foundation. So I hope you will come back and join for lesson 3 as we take it a step further in our examination of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. God bless you.